Hello, and happy Easter for this weekend, of course, beginning on Saturday, which celebrates the Easter Vigil, which is the major, as you remember, and most important, and in a certain way, the longest of our liturgies, is the great Easter celebration. And then on Easter Day, there are also, we also celebrate, of course, Easter, but there are also a set of readings for those. So what we're going to look at today, you remember last week that we were looking at the Passion account according to Mark, and I pointed out that we moved kind of quickly toward the end, that there were some things that maybe are important to consider and which are important in helping us move to the readings for, or the Gospels for Easter. Now, as I mentioned, the major Easter celebration would be Holy Saturday evening, the Easter Vigil, and the Gospel for that celebration comes from Mark, his last chapter, 16, verses 1 through 7. But I'm going to suggest that a better understanding of that would be to include verse 8, so that for various reasons, we'll talk a little bit about that, why that happened, that verse 8 is dropped and only verses 1 through 7 are offered for our consideration. If we were to also consider the particular gospel assigned for Easter Sunday, it would be the Gospel of John. But this week, we're only going to consider the Markan work, and next time, because John's Gospel is used throughout the Easter season on many occasions, we'll have an opportunity to go back and to look at his approach. So, you will remember that Mark's Passion narrative ends with Jesus' death on the cross, a very dramatic and very sad ending. As I mentioned last time, of all of the Passion narratives, the one according to Mark is the most stark. It ends with the words of Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, some argue that that's part of a psalm, and that may well be the case, Psalm 22, in which Jesus is pictured as praying on the cross. But others will point out that this faithful servant of God dies on the cross, apparently abandoned by everyone, except, and of course you remember when he dies, there remains a soldier, a Roman soldier, who makes the statement, "Truly this man was the Son of God." And that's the way in which we interpret it, that he is making an act of faith, that Jesus truly was the Son of God. There is a side interpretation, however, of those words in which the soldier says, "Truly he was the Son of God," could be a bit more critical, because joining with those who had, remember, kind of condemned him and mocked him out, may be joining to do that. But most of our interpretation take the words of the soldier here as an act of faith, that in which he identifies all that Jesus had done as truly being done as the work of God, and that he was the Son of God. Now, picking up right there, you will remember that there were also standing to the side a group of women, three of whom are named: Mary of Magdala, Mary, the mother of James and Joses, and Salome. Also mentions that there were a group of women, apparently around or with them, who had followed Jesus in Galilee, had come up with him to Jerusalem, and who were standing there watching what was happening. They are silent witnesses. Now, in some ways, why do we make mention of them? Because unlike the disciples who had left Jesus in a moment of crisis, these women at least are present, and there doesn't seem to be much that they could have done to alleviate what had happened to Jesus or to stop the crucifixion. They, in a certain way, were silent observers, but their presence was important. And we also remember at this point that there appears on the scene a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Now, this man, it's the first time that he appears in the gospel. It is true he appears in all four, but remember what I'm trying to suggest is that this was the first of the gospel writers to write, so the other three we didn't know yet, and so they kind of take this one as the model for what they are teaching and stressing. So Joseph of Arimathea in Mark's story is a stranger. He appears to be a Jew, and he mentions that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. That was the same group that had condemned Jesus, you remember, that had met and held him up for crucifixion. So exactly who Joseph of Arimathea was, we don't know. But here's what is interesting. He is pictured, Jesus is dead, as going to Pilate and boldly asking for the body of Jesus. Now, only someone who was of kind of important rank could get away with this with Pilate. I don't think you could just get an ordinary person, ordinary Jew, coming up to Pilate and saying, look, we want the body of Jesus, who you executed as a terrorist, as a criminal, and I want his body. Now, what's important here is you remember that people who died on the cross in this manner were generally thrown into a common grave, so that when Joseph intercedes in behalf of Jesus, he is really going to ask for something exceptional. Usually only the body of somebody important would be granted by Pilate, if at all. So the fact that there is a connection of some kind between Joseph and Pilate, although not explicitly stated, would certainly be the case, that he gets away with it. Although Pilate, again to show the upper hand, as I mentioned last time, sometimes we let Pilate get off the hook here as if he were not responsible ultimately for what happened to Jesus' death, questions whether or not when Joseph says that Jesus was dead, whether that's true, because he calls the Roman centurion, whom we just met, standing at the foot of the cross, to come and testify or verify that Jesus was really dead. So interestingly, he doesn't really take Joseph's word without having it backed up by one of his own. So again, Pilate will say to Joseph, I'm in charge. I'll let you have the body, but just remember who did it. See, so there is that interconnection I mentioned last time. To be very careful here, it's blaming the death of Jesus upon the Jews. As I mentioned last time, some of the Jewish leaders, the scribes, high priest up in Jerusalem, were responsible, but they too worked in cahoots, if you want, with Pilate on this. Anyway, Joseph gets the permission to take the body of Jesus down. He goes and buys a linen cloth. Interesting how certain pieces of clothing play a part in the story of Jesus. Remember the young man in the garden who had run away in his birthday suit, leaving behind a linen cloth. So Joseph now buys a linen cloth. The time frame would be very close here because they do not want, according to Jewish custom, the body of one who is executed to remain on the cross on the Sabbath. So the time frame would be if Jesus died at 3 o'clock, and most likely the beginning of the Passover, the starting of Passover would be somewhere around 6 o'clock. You do not have a long period of time here to get these things done. So Joseph takes the body of Jesus down, wraps him in this linen cloth, and then lays him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock. Now, there's a lot unsaid here. Whose tomb was this? Sometimes the assumption later on will be that it was Joseph's tomb. It's not what Mark says. It simply says that there was this tomb, and around the place where the execution on Calvary took place, there were little rock enclosures that certainly could have been and were apparently used by tombs. But even the burial place here would not be one of honor. To be buried close to the place of execution would also be sending a kind of message. Whatever, the rock has been carved out as a tomb, and Joseph places the body of Jesus in that place. He does not have, and being a good Jew, the proper burial rite would have been to wash the body, put certain spices on it, and then place it in a place of burial. Did not have time to do that. And so that's important to notice what will happen next. He rolls a large stone in front of the, and I say roll because I don't know any other way that you could put a large stone there except to roll it. And most of the pictures we have seem to indicate that that would be the way in which these entrances to carved out tombs were enclosed. And everyone departs. Now, Mark points out that, remember those three women who were named Mary, and Salome? Watch what happens. So these women watch as Jesus dies on the cross, watch as he is taken down by Joseph of Arimathea, watch where he is placed into the tomb. So all of this leads to certainly what we will begin to look at and celebrate this weekend. Now, the time is, and you remember that the way in which they kept the time in this part of the world, a little different than we do. Remember, it talks about the fact that it's on the third day that the two women come to the tomb. Well, how do you figure that out? Well, they figured that Friday was the first day, even though, remember, technically it would end around 6 o'clock. That was day one. Day two would be from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday is day two. And then, of course, Sunday would be day three. So that's how the little counting, I suspect you're familiar with that, but just some would say it's not exactly the way we do things, and it isn't, but that was the contemporary way of telling time then. So on the Sabbath day, nothing happens in Judaism. And that's why the women, and nobody could do anything because of the Sabbath. So very early on the first day of the week, before the sun rose, now it's an interesting, remember, a little characteristic of Mark, who likes to kind of double things. So very early in the morning, before the sun rose, is simply another way to say very early, isn't it? So it's kind of clever the way in which chapter 16, verse 1 begins. And it is very early in that morning then that the women come to, or are pictured as coming to the place where Jesus had been buried. Now, the rationale, and it does make some sense, is to carry out the rituals of burial that were not done and that could not have been done within the time frame of 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock. Also, in the book of Deuteronomy, by the way, it is mentioned that it was terrible for anyone who was executed to remain on the cross, that person was damned. And so in a certain way, Deuteronomy is very strong about this, but here, of course, we find a very different approach. As they are approaching to now do the burial rites for Jesus, although in some ways this would not seem to be very practical, because given the time frame from his death and the time that they came to the grave, the body would have already begun to decay. There would have been an odor. So in a certain way, what they were going to do was almost inconsequential. But they are pictured as women of devotion. And as they are moving along, they say, "Who will roll the stone back for us?" Because obviously the women realized that it was a rather large block to the entrance, and how were they going to get in? I don't know. I know that women can be pretty strong, so maybe they were thinking something else. But anyway, they raised this question so that, and here is now the astounding and amazing thing. As Mark pictures it, as they come to the tomb of Jesus, they find that the stone has been rolled away. There's no explanation as to how that has happened. And as they go into the tomb, they see sitting on the right hand of the place where the body of Jesus had laid a young man dressed in white. Now again, remember, there had been a young man who had left in the garden without white on. Now there's a young man here, but probably this young man, and the other evangelists later on will really picture this in the right way, is an angel sent by God. And remember, the role of angels is to make important announcements. And so, as the women now, you can picture in a word that Mark often likes to use, amazed or astonished. Well, this would astonish you. You come to a place where first of all, you don't know how you're going to get into it, but secondly, when you do find that the grave, you don't find the body there, but you find someone else sitting there and says, "You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth." Yes, he's not here. It's obvious as they look to see that the tomb is empty. And Mark does not tell us what goes through their minds, but you can imagine what has happened here. "You are looking for Jesus," says the messenger. "He will go before you into Galilee as he has said." Now, remember, and as we go through the year, we're going to come back to these sayings of Jesus again, but that 3 times in Mark's gospel, Jesus had been pictured as predicting what would happen when he came to Jerusalem. That the Son of Man would be handed over, that he would be arrested, hurt, crucified, and be raised up again. Well, now, those predictions that had been incorporated into Mark's story come to fulfillment. So, just as he had said the angel. Now, whether or not the women were really part of those occasions when Jesus had said this or not is another story. We really don't know. But the women are now given a job. They are sent on a mission. "Go and tell his disciples that he will go before you into Galilee." And it is, of course, in Galilee that the story of Jesus had really developed and had really begun. So this is the account, first time in the tradition of the Christian literature that the idea of the empty tomb is brought to our attention. It doesn't tell you very much, except that the body of Jesus is not there. Later on, gospel writers and others will say, well, maybe some humans kind of took the body of Jesus. But clearly, Mark sees here as a divine action. which brings amazement, which brings astonishment. And the women now, like the disciples, are told to go and tell the disciples that Jesus is risen. Now that would be the end of the gospel of Mark that we will hear on this given week, on the vigil, and it may well be used again on Sunday if you go to the Easter Sunday Mass. There is one verse that is missing, and that's verse 8. In verse 8, it says that the women went out astonished and afraid and told no one. And many believe that that is the end of the Gospel of Mark. It ends kind of dramatically. Without if you were writing a story, it probably wouldn't be the kind of ending that you would like, okay? And also these women are afraid. And now there are kind of practically, you could see what the women said, and later on in other Gospels they will bring this up. Women told us, what you know of women. And so even those sections of the Gospel play down the importance of women. Now, this, we believe, is the original ending of the Gospel of Mark, the opening 8 chapters. Now, when you go home and take your Bible, you're going to say, wait a minute. I read further that there are verses 9 through 20. Why do you say that it ended there? Well, here's a little bit of background as we're looking at the Markan story this year. That already in the 2nd century, there were those who felt that this ending to Mark's gospel left you up in the air, that we needed to do something about it. So someone, and there are now generally those who study the Gospel of Mark, point out that there were 2 endings, a short ending and a longer ending. The shorter ending is the verse 9, which simply says that the word of Jesus' resurrection was known, people came to believe, and the gospel ended. Others thought that's too short too, so they added another series of verses to chapter 16, I'm sorry. Now, why do we know that these are additions? Well, the vocabulary is different in these verses. Remember that they would have been written in Greek. So when you hear them in English, well, an English translator could kind of make it all work kind of well, and we wouldn't notice the difference. But those who look at the text in its original language do notice this difference. So the literary style is different. The content that is brought in to these verses is different. And from what we can see is far different from the style and etc. of Mark's gospel. So the short ending, verse 8 of chapter 16. The long ending, verse 9 through 20. And what does that long ending entail? Apparently, by the time that the community got around to addressing this issue, we had the Gospel of Matthew, we had the Gospel of Luke, we had the Gospel of John, so they kind of took the best they thought of these different ideas and wove it into the final verses of Mark's story. So they did not like the way it ended, and this was the way early Christians of different backgrounds kind of concluded the Gospel of Mark. But more accurately then, Mark's Gospel ends, as I mentioned, in verse 8. Why? Why does Mark end it like that? And a number of explanations have been thought. Here's one, that actually there were more verses, but they got lost, or somewhere along the line, the dog ate the last verse. No, but somehow the last part of his gospel was torn away. Well, those are nice attempts to kind of explain what happened. Or Mark never got around to finishing it. Some way he got called home or something like that. But now, when we look at it, in a certain way, perhaps it's very interesting that it ends this way. Jesus is risen. He goes before you. Who are to be the proclaimers? Who are to live out the gospel message? But all who hear this story. We know, and in fact, by the way, remember I mentioned that Peter, when he had denied Jesus, went out and wept, and that Peter kind of comes off in a bad way? Well, think about this. By the time that this gospel is written, Peter, most likely, by all the evidence we have, had already died for the sake of Jesus. He had come to accept the risen Jesus and had come to share that mission. Remember that we traditionally believe that Peter died in Rome. The Gospel of Mark is aimed at a community of Roman Christians. And so all of this would be, the one that in a certain way looked to fail had accepted forgiveness and had become a believer. And so that's one way of understanding this ending, that it reached out into the story that the Christian readers of Mark's gospel knew. Or another understanding is that the whole message of Mark is circular. Remember how the gospel begins. The good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God, Son of David. So if now one takes the ending here, the open tomb, Jesus is alive, Jesus is risen, and go back now, where does the story begin? In the Galilee. Go back now to the opening of Mark's gospel and look at the whole story of Jesus again. We will notice, and we will talk about this as we go through the Markan year, that very often his disciples misunderstand or miss certain events in Jesus' life. So in a kind of clever way, the gospel writer says, let us go back and look at the whole story and message of Jesus again. And perhaps in that way, we will come to appreciate it and also to live it more fully. So that's a popular explanation, one that I think does make a certain sense. So that, therefore, brings to an end on this Easter day the gospel tradition according to Mark. There are no appearance stories in Mark's gospel. Jesus does not appear to anyone, but where is he? In the world, in the action of those who are believers of Jesus. Just in closing, there is in the Easter Sunday Mass what is known as a sequence called the Victimae Paschali Laudes. There you go, those of you who are Latin lovers, okay? Praise to the Paschal victim. And it is, there were a series of sequences were produced in the Middle Ages. They were like early plays, and they would kind of tell different stories. Over the years, we have abandoned most of the sequences, but the sequence for Easter stays, and it will be sung or said after the second reading on Easter Sunday, not at the Easter Vigil, but on Easter Sunday. But it's a wonderful treasure of the church, which goes all the way back to the 11th century of our time. And as I say, very, very often people remember when they came to church in those days, the language was in Latin, and they didn't really understand it. But the sequences, they did understand. So, for example, it's this sequence, and you can read it over, listen to it. Tell us, Mary, what you saw on the way on the tomb, so you get a little dialogue that goes on. So I just mentioned this. It is not terribly scriptural, but it is a kind of nice part of our liturgy that we use on this wonderful occasion, important occasion of celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. So once again, thank you for being with us today, and best wishes for a very happy and holy Easter season, and hopefully we will see you again as now the season unfolds.